Hello, my name's Joe Garland, and I'm going to be reading from a story I wrote, and that was in the first issue of Loft. The story is entitled How I Became a Writer by Alicia Cadbury. Here goes. I discovered this essay in a long since gone literary magazine when I was researching the Gilded Age. I found almost no information online about this Alicia Crowley, the author, but her essay I found interesting and I wanted to share it. Here it goes. I will tell my story and hope you find it of some interest and of more use. Now, I cannot say my journey is similar to anyone else's, as we each write from our own experiences. But I can say that part of ourselves inevitably appears in our words, and so knowing whence we came can be useful to understanding us. So how did I become a writer? I must tell you about myself first. If you have read my novels, you will suspect that I'm from a wealthy New York family. You would be right. I was born and reared in a mansion on East 28th Street near Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. I am the only daughter. I have two older brothers and two younger brothers. As to my education, my fate was set upon my birth in 1851. My formal education began with governesses and ended at a small school for light girls on 23rd Street. My informal education was a daily thing almost from the day I first walked. My mother and my two aunts tried to prepare me for the life I was to lead as a wife and as a mother. And my life did proceed much as it was meant to proceed. I was neither too attractive nor too plain. I fell within the broad school of eligible and hopefully fertile girls. I entered society at a ball in December of 1869. With that credential, I began the stage of being a young woman in society. I frequented parties with similar girls and eligible boys. We girls were so naive. We knew the ritual from our mothers and aunts and older sisters for some, and we were trained to speak well, but not too much, to smile and to be pleasant. My brother Stephen, 2 years older than me, was my savior. He told me the truth about the boys in whom I had any interest and provided information about those who displayed an interest in me. Several of them approached him to ask whether I might be similarly inclined with them. Any formal engagement would depend upon more than a mutual affection, of course. Based on a family's circumstances, a marriage was often a financial arrangement. But because we were wealthy enough and my father was indulgent enough, I did not fear having to marry for money. It would be for love, as my romances told me it would be, though I do not believe at the time I understood what love actually meant. Yes, my romances, I devoured them, and with my friends, and we exchanged them amongst ourselves and spoke about them ad infinitum. We would marry for love. Our stories told us that a marriage based on necessity and not mutual devotion and physical attraction could not help but be a horrible one, and we were all determined not to enter into such a travesty. Yes, we would all marry for love, and as it happened, I found just the man for it, not 6 months after my coming out. His name was Stephen Bowden. I noticed him at several parties and balls. I noticed that he noticed me. We had several dances and took several strolls together. He often brought me refreshments at a ball, and we conversed while we drank or while we went on those strolls. Our exchanges were always innocent, but the not so innocent was always just below the surface, my surface at least. Some months after James and I met, Stephen said my James, as he shall always be, approached him at their club. Might you mention me to your sister, Stephen said, he had asked. Do you know whether she might have an interest in someone like me? My brother was amused by my James's trepidation, though I think he himself was similarly banal when he himself finally found a woman in whom he had an interest, who happens now to be my sister-in-law. The Bowdens themselves were also wealthy, and Stephen assured me that James was a well-thought-of man. My brother said nothing about his looks, of course, but I assure you that they were far better than a woman has any reason to expect. He was several inches taller than me, was James, and he had a round face and a slim body, and he kept his hair a little long. I often imagined running my fingers through that hair. He studied at Columbia College, and his body reflected the fact that he rode there as well. It was not long before I was well in love with him, by which point I understood what love actually meant. And soon thereafter, he whispered that he loved me. When he sought my father's permission to ask for my hand, my father consented. I did not know of this conversation, of course, though I often imagined that it would someday take place. The sooner the better. But the very next morning, a Sunday, I found myself happily next to him as we left services and turned for my house, as we so often did. Several blocks north of the church, we lagged behind the others, and my arm found itself through his, and I was oblivious to our innocent talk, to his society, as someone described lovers in a novel I would come to love some years later, my most exquisite enjoyment. As we waited to cross 23rd Street on the way home, my dearest James stepped away from me and turned. He reached for my hand and lifted my fingers to his lips for a kiss. Before I could react, I heard him ask for it, that is, my hand. And I heard myself tell him he could have that, for he already had all the rest of me. I fear we blocked many people with the hug we shared, and I'm sure many who passed wondered at my tears. My family had stopped word from Stephen as to what was likely to be happening behind them, and they rushed to offer congratulations all around when we stood, as my friends and his friends later would. Yet I must tell you that I'm not married. I must tell you that I never have been married. I did not wish this on anyone. My James died before the wedding, taken by God too soon, taken by God too cruelly. At that moment, when I received the news, I became a different person, or perhaps I was revealed to be a person who differed from what she always thought herself to be. It was because of my passionless grief about James and my loss of all hope after that tragedy that I became a writer. I disappeared into my father's library. It was a most masculine place with dark paneling and shelves upon shelves of books. My contact with the room before this, as I was growing up, was to use it as a place to hide from my mother, or more often, one or another of my brothers. My father, from whom I would never dare hide, took pride in those books in his library. It was in the right rear corner of the house with large windows looking out to the mansion on 27th Street. Because the room faced to the north, it exaggerated how dark the paneled walls and rows of leather books were, saved by a generous supply of gas lights that had replaced the candle sconces that were originally installed. The room had two large windows, and against each was a window seat of the kind where I imagined Jane Eyre tried to hide from that awful cousin who came to no good. I too found refuge there, as I tried to hide now. I entered the worlds of my father's books to escape my own collapsed one. I had been a reader before this, as I said. That was of lesser works, although I assure you I no longer think them so. I inhaled in those quiet days and evenings of my innocence, romances mostly, but adventure stories too. These are the ones that my friends and I shared again and again. For over a week after James's death, interrupted only by his funeral, the only time I left the house, I kept to the library, except to have my meals in my room, to make my toilet, and to sleep. I explored the shelves in the library, running my fingers across the books' leather spines. I started with those I knew of but had not read. Some were as yet unopened, and I cut their pages. At first, I found the going difficult, and I put several down. I was determined, though, to discover these stories and their characters. In those initial dark days, I sat in the window seat or on a chair and read. I often recited passage aloud. I began to enjoy the sound of the words and the rhythm of the sentence, and it became a habit. And I frequently do that for a novel's initial chapters, as I find it brings me, the reading out loud, into the story, even if I remain silent for the rest of the way. I cannot say how many books I finished in that period, but it was enough to tell me that I could tell my own stories. Thoughts of plots and characters and dialogue appeared to me as I fell asleep and when I first awoke. To end my torment about my loss, I would write. I did not know if I would be capable and was certain that I would never be as proficient as any of these authors that I read, but I would write. I searched, and I found a stack of pristine stationery in the lower left-hand drawer of my father's desk. In the center drawer were pens and two half-filled etched glass inkwells set imposingly in the center of the desktop. I could not let anyone know what I was doing. I made sure I could quickly hide my jottings in a drawer, although only my mother ever tried to enter in this period, hoping to induce me to rejoin the family. My first scratches were incompetent odes to my lost James, but as I wrote them, it was as though the deep emotions I had for him were transferred from me to the page. And when that was accomplished, they were gone from me in some way. I've heard of similar things with some tribes, and perhaps it is true, or perhaps I so wanted it to be true that it did in fact happen. I no longer dreamt of him. This is difficult to admit, but it is the truth. I no longer considered my life at an end for not having him by my side, much as I truly loved him, and in part, much of me still does. With that simple act of putting my emotions on pieces of paper, I realized that I was independent and always could be. Independence would come at a price in the world I knew, though. I would be branded unusual and, worse to some, unmarriable. I did not care. I did not, I warn you, consider the practical consequences of that realization. And if you read this and think that turning to the life of an author is like one of the characters, one of the romance books you admire, I fear I must advise you that you are mistaken. For one must eat. I was fortunate beyond measure in my choice of parents, for they were, as I have noted, the indulgent sort, and rich. Much of this I learned only later when I left the house on 28th Street to live on my own on Elizabeth Street, with the generous allowance my father gives me. But I was speaking of his library in the autumn of 1870. It was late afternoon, and I was, as usual, sitting at my father's desk and scribbling away. Without knocking, Stephen entered. He strode directly to one of the leather chairs that faced the desk and sat in as nonchalant a manner as a young man in an uncomfortable suit can sit in a leather chair. He said nothing, and I tried to ignore him as he watched me write. He stood and turned on several gas lights, it beginning to darken. Before going to one of the shelves and grabbing some book or another, he returned to the chair and began to read, though I thought at the time, and still believe, that he was only pretending to do it. After some time, I put my pen down hard, so he heard it, and his head looked up. I'm writing a book, I told him. Broke the extended silence. He looked up. A what? A book. I'm writing a book. It is what I've been doing here. He closed his volume loudly and looked over at me. His tone changed, almost gentle. What is your book about? I reached to the stack of pages that were clumsily stacked beside me on the desktop and held it up. He came over and took it from me. You wrote this? I nodded, and he returned to and plopped back down on his chair and thumbed through the pages, abounding in lines and lines of my neat script. It was not the odes to a lost love, which I had originally done, and which made up for their lack of literary merit with emotional thrust, but it was the beginnings of a story about a dreamy-eyed girl who finds her heart stolen by a delivery boy who comes by her home regularly. He stopped at various pages and read, unlike what he was doing with that earlier book. Parts of this are not bad, was his verdict after some time and rustling through the papers. Not bad at all. As best as I can tell, the plot is a bit ridiculous, though I suppose that there is a market for ridiculous plots. But your words are very nice. I cannot convey to you what his reaction meant to me. He returned the pages to my father's desk. Are you serious about this? I nodded, and he sat back down in the chair. As I say, this is not bad. I will do what I can to help you, but you must agree to one thing. I looked at him. You must agree to the world, to return to the world. It may not be the world in which you will remain, but you must come back to it now, as it exists. And I will do what I can to support what you write. Which is how I found my first critic, and most importantly, my first editor. It was our secret for a time. I agreed to emerge from the library and return to a life of some normalcy. My parents granted me leave to keep to myself on afternoons when I was not out visiting with my mother. And everyone but Stephen assumed I was fully back in their world, albeit in mourning. Stephen bought paper and other supplies so that what I took from my father's drawer would not be missed. And he, Stephen, took portions of the book I started after banning the ridiculous one with the delivery boy so that they would not be discovered. He also took to reading my day's output, and after I completed a chapter or two, he asked if he could comment on it. I would not allow it, only when the novel was done. And when it was done, I assure you, it was a most trying time between me giving the final pages to him to read and his telling me what he thought. It was a very rough thing, what I wrote, but it was a start, and it was my start. Stephen, did not dislike it, and that was enough to pursue it. The novel was indeed a story of a plain girl coming out in society and how she is deceived by several supposedly appropriate suitors and loses her heart to one of them. She is rescued, though not by a delivery boy. If you read it, as I hope you have, and if you have not, please do not read the balance of this sentence, You know she is rescued by the older brother of a longtime friend of her own brother. Of course, if there is any magic in this story, my story, it is how it is told. My words went through, I cannot say how many revisions, and when Stephen and I thought them satisfactory, I employed a scrivener to prepare copies. We brought the rest of the family into the fold to varying degrees of shock. The manuscript itself was passed around to generally pleasing reviews among our circle. Through their clubs, my father and my eldest brother Richard were able to get publishers to consider it. Each was encouraging, but only one thought enough of it to pursue actually publishing it. I planned on doing so privately ahead before this and distributing it lightly, but could not deny the benefits of a broader audience a real publisher would give it. The novel itself was well received when it was finally published. Publisher and my father's influence led to several reviews, and those reviews were, for the most part, favorable. It was enough of these responses to allow me, with my father and mother's blessing, to begin, or I think to continue, my life as a writer. I could not have done so without their support. Perhaps someday they will not be so, but I'm young and try to be honest with you. I'm blessed to be able to write and to publish additional books which have been received in varying degrees of enthusiasm. And several works of pulp fiction, which I confess I enjoy writing, and which I confess sell more copies than any of the other things I do. And to be asked to share my experience for this anthology is a blessing. You should not imagine that I abandoned my dreams of finding love with the death of my James and the change that led to my life as a writer. You will read in my recent novels and in my pulp works, I hope, the soul of contentment I am for having again found love. That is something I cannot tell you about, for that is my unique journey, undertaken and I hope completed after I became a writer. Fondly, Alicia Cadbury. And that is the end of my piece on the first issue of Loft, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.